When most people picture World War II, they picture the explosion. They picture tanks rolling across Europe, cities burning under bomber formations, Hitler screaming into microphones, soldiers storming beaches, civilians picking their way through rubble, and entire countries disappearing under fire. They picture the war once it was already in motion, once the machine had already been built, once the killing had grown too large to stop with speeches, signatures, and one more desperate round of diplomacy. Those are the images history remembers best because they're the loudest and most violent. They're the images of collapse in full view of the world. But the deadliest war in human history didn't begin there. Europe didn't wake up one morning and suddenly find itself trapped inside World War II. It slid there. It slid there through humiliation, fear, economic collapse, political weakness, wounded pride, and ideologies that promised rebirth with preparing ruin. That's what makes this story so disturbing. The road into hell wasn't hidden, it was built in public, one decision, one grievance, one excuse, and one gamble at a time. By the time the shooting started in 1939, the deeper damage had already been done. Europe had spent 20 years carrying the wreckage of the last war inside its politics, its economies, its borders, and the minds of people who'd seen too much death to trust peace and too much instability to trust democracy. This isn't just the story of one dictator, even though one dictator would come to dominate it. And it isn't just the story of Germany, even though Germany would become the most dangerous fault line on the continent. This is the story of a wounded civilization trying to rebuild after one nightmare and in the process laying the foundations for another. To understand how Europe slid into hell, you have to start with the last time it nearly tore itself apart. When the guns of World War I finally went quiet in 1918, Europe didn't look like a continent ready to recover. It looked like a continent that had been broken open. Millions of men were dead. Millions more came home mutilated, blinded, burned, poisoned, or psychologically shattered. Families were trying to rebuild around absence. Whole towns had lost huge portions of a generation. Vast stretches of land had been chewed apart by trenches, artillery, and industrial slaughter on a scale the world had never seen before. Even the victors didn't emerge looking triumphant. They came out exhausted, scarred, and burned by debt, grief, and the creeping sense that the old world had failed catastrophically. That failure mattered just as much as the physical destruction. Before 1914, many Europeans still believed that their civilization, however flawed, was stable and advancing. Then the First World War turned nationalism into a furnace and fed millions of young men into it. It showed entire populations that modern states could organize industry, science, bureaucracy, and patriotism into a machine for mass death. By the end of the war, Europe wasn't just mourning, it was disillusioned. The political map had been shattered right along with that illusion. The German Empire collapsed. Austria-Hungary broke apart. The Ottoman Empire began to come undone. Russia exploded into revolution and civil war. The balance of power that had governed Europe before 1914 was gone. In its place stood new governments, new states, new borders, and a continent trying to convince itself that a stable order could be built out of debris and blood. But collapsed empires don't leave behind tidy inheritances. They leave behind vacuum, grievance, and unresolved tension. Into that mess stepped the diplomats who gathered to shape the peace. Their task sounded simple enough. The war was over. Now they had to build a Europe that would prevent another one. In reality, they were trying to do that while carrying different fears, different priorities, and different definitions of justice. France wanted security above almost everything else. Britain wanted balance and feared total instability. The United States spoke in the language of principle and self-determination. But ideals collided quickly with old rivalries, territorial claims, and the emotional weight of what the war had cost. That collision produced the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war's damage under the treaty framework, surrender territory, pay reparations, and live under military restrictions. Some of those terms were strategic, some were punitive, all of them were political. To millions of Germans, Versailles didn't feel like the close of a lost war. It felt like a settlement designed to formalize defeat, weakness, and humiliation. Humiliation rarely stays quiet. It gets remembered, sharpened, and retold. It becomes more than a policy problem. It becomes a wound in a nation's identity. But the post-war order wasn't unstable simply because Germany was angry. It was unstable because it satisfied almost nobody. Many Germans saw it as vindictive and illegitimate. Some in France feared it still didn't do enough to permanently contain Germany. Across Central and Eastern Europe, new borders created new tensions almost immediately. New states appeared, but they didn't appear in neat, uncontested space. Minorities found themselves on the wrong side of lines they hadn't chosen. Old grievances survived the new maps. So while Europe technically had peace after 1918, it didn't have reconciliation, stability, or deep legitimacy. It had exhaustion, bitterness, financial strain, broken faith in old institutions, and a Germany that saw itself humiliated rather than settled. On paper, the fighting was over. In reality, Europe was sitting inside a wounded pause and calling it order. And nowhere did that poisoned peace cut deeper than in Germany, where defeat didn't just topple an empire, it shattered trust in the world that came after it. The Germany that emerged from World War I wasn't simply a defeated country. It was a humiliated, unstable, and psychologically disoriented one. The Kaiser was gone. The empire had collapsed. In its place came the Weimar Republic, a democratic government born not in confidence, but in defeat. In theory, democracy represented a new beginning. In practice, for huge numbers of Germans, it became tied to surrender, humiliation, and disorder from the start. The new republic inherited the pain of the old regime's collapse, and with it, much of the blame. Germany didn't move from war into peaceful democratic adjustment. It lurched into chaos, confrontation, and myth-making. One of the most poisonous developments was the stab in the back myth. The lie that Germany hadn't truly been beaten in the field, but betrayed from within by politicians, leftists, and Jews. That myth gave millions of people a way to reinterpret defeat as treason rather than reality. Instead of facing military exhaustion and strategic failure, they were handed a story that protected pride and redirected anger. That kind of lie is politically powerful because it makes compromise look like complicity. If the Republic is associated with surrender, and its opponents are telling the public that surrender itself was a betrayal, then democracy stops looking like a path forward. It starts looking like part of the crime. The streets reflected that mood. Early Weimar Germany wasn't a calm parliamentary society working through hardship in an orderly way. It was brittle, violent, and full of factions that increasingly saw one another as existential threats. Communist uprisings flared, right-wing militias organized, coup attempts shook the state, assassinations turned politics into blood sport. Large parts of the public looked at that instability and didn't see democracy as strength. They saw drift, weakness, and permanent emergency. Then came the economic humiliation. Hyperinflation became one of the defining traumas of early Weimar Germany. It wrecked savings, discredited institutions, and left behind a deep fear that ordinary life could collapse without warning. Families who thought they had security watched it evaporate. Money itself seemed to lose meaning. The famous image of Germans hauling wheelbarrows of near worthless currency stuck for a reason. It captured something deeper than financial collapse. It captured the humiliation of a society that felt it could no longer trust the system that was supposed to hold daily life together. That kind of collapse changes people. It makes abstract politics personal. It makes competence more attractive than principle. It makes the promise of order sound more comforting than the promise of freedom, especially when freedom appears to come packaged with chaos, inflation, and a state that seems unable to keep control. Germany wasn't just politically unstable in those years. It was emotionally unstable. It was full of people who felt disgraced abroad, betrayed at home, and vulnerable in daily life. To be fair, Weimar Germany wasn't in non-stop collapse from the moment it was born. There were stretches in the 1920s when conditions improved, diplomacy eased, and parts of German society looked vibrant and modern. For a time, it seemed possible that the Republic might survive its traumatic birth and grow into something durable. But the calmer years never erased the deeper damage. The resentment remained. The myths remained. The distrust remained. The humiliation remained. That's what made Weimar Germany so dangerous. It wasn't doomed by fate. It was weakened by defeat, myth, violence, and repeated shocks. And that made it vulnerable to anyone who could turn pain into narrative and grievance into a promise of restoration. Hyperinflation had already taught millions of Germans that normal life could collapse in humiliating ways. The Depression would teach them that normal politics might collapse with it. For a brief stretch in the 1920s, it was possible to believe that Europe might steady itself. The war was over. Germany's worst inflation had eased. Diplomats spoke the language of normalization. Trade resumed. Governments tried to function. In some cities, especially among the educated and comfortable, there was even a sense that modern Europe might emerge from the wreckage wiser and more stable than before. But much of that stability was thinner than it looked. It rested on fragile credit, uneasy political compromise, and a public mood that had never truly healed. Then came the Great Depression, and whatever illusion of stability remained started to give way. When the American market crashed in 1929, it didn't stay an American problem. Panic spread through the banks, loans, trade networks, production lines, and employment across the Atlantic. The global economy tightened like a fist. Businesses failed. Credit dried up. Trade contracted. Unemployment exploded. And because Europe was still economically fragile, burdened by debts, reparations, and political tension, the new collapse struck a continent that had never fully recovered from the old one. Germany was hit especially hard. Its partial recovery in the 1920s had depended heavily on foreign capital and financial arrangements, more vulnerable than they appeared. Once those supports started falling away, Germany's economy buckled fast. Factories slowed or shut down. Jobs disappeared. Public confidence cratered. Families that had already lived through defeat, inflation, and humiliation were now hit with fresh insecurity on a massive scale. The Republic no longer looked like a government struggling through hardship. It looked like a system failing in real time. That kind of moment is politically lethal to moderation. Moderate governments speak the language of compromise, patience, and gradual repair. In stable years, that can sound responsible. In years of mass unemployment, it can sound weak. When people are frightened and watching normal life come apart around them, they don't usually reward leaders who seem to be managing decline. They look for certainty. They look for force. They look for anyone who can make chaos sound temporary and suffering sound purposeful. That was the opening extremists needed. On the left, communists offered revolution. On the right, nationalists offered unity, authority, discipline, and rebirth. In Germany, the far right had a particularly potent advantage because it could fuse economic pain with national humiliation. It could tell the unemployed worker, the ruined shopkeeper, the embittered veteran, and the frightened middle-class family that their suffering wasn't random. Germany had been betrayed, shackled, insulted, and now crushed by a corrupt and feeble system with no longer deserved loyalty. That story was dishonest and catastrophic, but politically, it was powerful because it turned confusion into clarity. It gave pain a target. It gave humiliation a narrative. It told people they weren't the remains of a failed nation, but the raw material of a restored one. The center, by comparison, looked procedural and tired. And in a collapsing society, emotional force matters. The Great Depression didn't invent Germany's resentments, myths, or extremism. What it did was turn them into a full political emergency. It shattered the illusion that the Republic could simply limp along and convinced millions of people that whatever normal politics had to offer, it was no longer enough. Into that fear, into that humiliation, and into that hunger for certainty stepped Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler didn't rise in a healthy country and convince it to abandon reason all at once. He rose in a country already humiliated, destabilized, and exhausted by years of defeat, resentment, myth, and collapse. That doesn't excuse what happened. It explains why his message found such fertile ground. Hitler understood something many of his opponents didn't. In a broken society, people don't just want policy. They want explanation. They want belonging. They want a story big enough to carry their anger and simple enough to make their suffering feel meaningful. That was what Hitler offered. He didn't present himself merely as a politician with a platform. He presented himself as the voice of a betrayed nation, the man who could identify the enemies within, tear up the humiliations imposed from outside, and restore Germany to strength, unity, and purpose. His politics were built on rage, nationalism, racial hatred, conspiracy, and theoretical certainty. He told Germans that their country had simply been weakened. It had been sabotaged. That's one of the most dangerous things about fascist politics. It doesn't just offer solutions, it offers purification. It tells its followers that they don't need to wrestle honestly with the cause of decline. They need to identify and remove the people supposedly responsible for it. Under Hitler, anti-Semitism wasn't a side feature or background prejudice. It was central to the Nazi worldview. Jews were cast as hidden enemies behind capitalism, communism, moral decay, defeat, and weakness, all at once. The contradictions didn't matter. Conspiracy thinking doesn't survive by being coherent. It survives by being useful. But Hitler's appeal wasn't built on hatred alone. It was built on performance, discipline, and emotional force. Nazi rallies, uniforms, symbols, slogans, and relentless propaganda created the impression of a movement that wasn't drifting through parliamentary weakness, but marching toward destiny. In a Germany that had come to associate democracy with fragmentation and drift, the Nazis made politics feel organized, purposeful, and inevitable. For many supporters, that was intoxicating. It offered identity in a period of chaos and certainty in a period of fear. You didn't need to navigate complexity. You needed to believe, obey, and join the national revival. That's how political religion works. It turns a wounded society into a congregation and a demagogue into a prophet. Hitler also benefited from one of the oldest mistakes made by conservative elites in periods of crisis. Many thought they could use him. They saw his mass appeal and convinced themselves he could be brought into power, boxed in, and controlled. In their minds, he was a tool who could crush the left and stabilize the country. It was a fatal miscalculation. Men who thought they were inviting him into the machine discovered too late that he intended to become the machine. When Hitler became chancellor in 1933, the collapse of democratic restraints happened with brutal speed. Crisis became justification. Rights were stripped away. Opposition was harassed, arrested, silenced, or destroyed. Political pluralism was dismantled. Independent institutions were bent or broken. What had been a fragile republic became a dictatorship organized around obedience, exclusion, spectacle, and force. And once that transformation began, Germany itself began to change character. This was no longer merely a country with nationalist grievances and political instability. It was now a regime rebuilding military power, centralizing authority, and teaching its people to see conflict, expansion, and racial struggle as natural expressions of national life. Hitler hadn't solved Germany's wounds. He had weaponized them. But Germany wasn't turning hard in isolation. Across Europe, democracy itself was losing prestige, and authoritarianism was gaining momentum. One of the easiest mistakes to make when looking back at the 1930s is to treat Germany as though it became dangerous in a vacuum. It didn't. Germany was the most explosive case, and Hitler the most catastrophic figure. But the wider continental mood mattered. The interwar years weren't a clean march toward liberal stability. In many places, they were years of disillusionment, hardening, and retreat from the very political values that were supposed to keep Europe from tearing itself apart again. Italy had already shown part of the pattern. Benito Mussolini came into power before Hitler and offered a model of authoritarian rule that promised order, unity, discipline, and national pride in place of preliminary weakness and social conflict. Fascism in Italy didn't look identical to Nazism in Germany, but it helped normalize the idea that liberal democracy wasn't the inevitable future and that forceful anti-democratic government could present itself as modern, energetic, and necessary across Europe. Even where governments didn't become fascist in the strict sense, democracy often looked weak. Parliamentary systems were fragmented. Coalition politics felt indecisive. Economic crisis deepened social distrust. Traditional elites feared mass politics when it leaned left, but often tolerated repression when it leaned right. Nationalism hardened. Censorship increased. Political movements grew more militant. The language of compromise lost prestige in a continent that increasingly craved firmness and clarity. Fear of communism played a huge role in that shift. The Russian Revolution hadn't just transformed Russia. It had sent shockwaves through the political imagination of Europe. To industrialists, landowners, conservatives, monarchists, church leaders, and many middle-class citizens, communism looked like class war, property seizure, and a social collapse. The Soviet Union became more than a state in their minds. It became a symbol of what they feared most. And once that fear takes hold, it changes what people are willing to tolerate on the other side. Movements that might otherwise look brutal begin to look useful if they promise to block revolution. That dynamic gave authoritarian movements room to grow. Anti-communism became a shield, a justification, and a recruiting tool. Repression could be framed as defense. Violence could be framed as necessity. Democratic scruples could be dismissed as luxuries that unstable countries could no longer afford. In that atmosphere, political violence started becoming familiar again. Uninformed movements, street intimidation, crackdowns, censorship, and leader worship all became more common parts of public life. The Spanish Civil War exposed just how dangerous that continental mood had become. Spain's conflict was, in one sense, a national struggle over power, ideology, class, religion, and the future of the state. But it was also a preview of what Europe was becoming. Foreign powers intervened. Ideological camps across the continent treated the war like a moral test. Civilians suffered. Brutality escalated. The conflict became a rehearsal for the wider hatreds already building across Europe. By the middle of the 1930s, Europe wasn't a healthy body being infected by one diseased regime. It was a continent full of weakness, fear, polarization, and deep mistrust in democratic solutions. Some countries were more stable than others. Some institutions were stronger than others. But the mood of the age was hardening, and that made the continent far more vulnerable to men who knew how to turn fear into momentum. And while dictators grew bolder, the democracies that might have checked them were still trapped in the memory of the last slaughter. From the safety of hindsight, appeasement is often treated like a punchline, a symbol of weakness so obvious that only fools could have embraced it. But history gets flatter and dumber when it's told that way. Appeasement failed catastrophically, but it didn't appeal to people because they were all blind or absurd. It appealed to them because Britain and France were making decisions in the shadow of the First World War. And that shadow was enormous. The men leading those democracies and the publics they answered to remembered the trenches. They remembered towns emptied of young men, hospitals full of broken bodies, and cemeteries that seemed to stretch forever. They remembered debt, grief, and the sense that an entire generation had been chewed up in a conflict so vast that even the victors had emerged scarred. Almost anything but another war wasn't a joke to people who had lived through that. It was a serious instinct. There was also the question of readiness. Britain and France were operating from a position of total confidence. Rearmament was incomplete. Political systems were slower and more divided than dictatorships. Economic recovery was uneven. Many leaders genuinely doubted whether their countries were materially or psychologically prepared for another major war in Europe. States don't make decisions in laboratory conditions. They make them inside fear, constraint, and political reality. Then there was the question of Germany itself. To some outside observers, not every early German demand looked equally outrageous. Versailles had left real bitterness behind it, and some believed parts of the settlement had been too rigid, too punitive, or too detached from self-determination. If Germany wanted military equality, or the return of certain populations that didn't automatically sound like the opening chapter of world conquest, to many reasonable people at the time, it sounded like dangerous but potentially manageable revision. Appeasement wasn't simply weakness. It was a policy shaped by trauma, unreadiness, and the hope that limited concessions might preserve peace long enough for Britain and France to avoid, or at least delay, another continental bloodbath. What made appeasement fatal wasn't that diplomacy itself was foolish. It was that Hitler treated diplomacy as a pressure tool. While Britain and France kept hoping it was still a path to settlement, that distinction is everything. Appeasement can only work if both sides are trying to avoid the same catastrophe. Britain and France were trying to avoid another war. Hitler was trying to exploit their fear of one. He understood that if he moved in increments, framed each demand as limited, and timed each crisis well, he could keep forcing the same choice on his opponents. confront me now with all the risks that implies, or accept one more concession and hope this is the last one. That hope was powerful because the alternative felt unbearable. To the publics of Britain and France, war wasn't an abstraction, so appeasement felt, to many, like a reasonable answer. It looked patient, humane, and serious. That's part of what makes it tragic. The impulse behind it was understandable. The result was disastrous. The democracies weren't asleep. They were traumatized, divided, and badly misreading the kind of enemy they were dealing with. And once Hitler realized how far that fear would go, he started testing the limits again and again. Once Hitler had consolidated power inside Germany, the question was no longer whether he would change the post-war order. The question was how far he could go before someone stopped him. And one of the great tragedies of the 1930s is that each time he tested that question, the answer kept coming back the same way. Further than he should have been able to. Every successful gamble taught him something. Europe was divided, hesitant, and frightened of the cost of resistance. The first major signal came with rearmament. Germany had been restricted by Versailles, at least on paper, but Hitler had no intention of keeping Germany inside the military cage built after World War I. Rearmament wasn't just a policy project. It was a declaration that Germany would reclaim strength, pride, and reject the limits that had come to symbolize national humiliation. Then came the Rhineland in 1936, one of the major turning points of the decade. Under the post-war settlement, the Rhineland was meant to remain demilitarized as a buffer against renewed German aggression. When Hitler sent troops into it, he was taking a real risk. The German military wasn't yet ready for a major war, and if France had responded decisively, the move could have become a humiliating setback. But that response never came. The gamble worked. And because it worked, its importance went far beyond the territory itself. Hitler learned that the powers with the ability to stop him might not actually use it. The Rhineland also mattered psychologically. It was another step in dismantling the humiliation of Versailles, and in Germany, it could be presented as a restoration of sovereignty. No large war followed. No devastating punishment came. That strengthened Hitler at home and weakened the credibility of those abroad who'd warned that each new violation mattered. Austria came next. The language used to justify Anschluss was emotionally potent. Shared identity, shared language, national unity. But beneath that language was the same basic pattern. A dictatorship was expanding, and the rest of Europe was still searching for ways to interpret expansion as correction rather than escalation. Then the pressure turned toward Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, where a large ethnic German population allowed Hitler to wrap expansion in the language of self-determination. It was one of his great political tricks. He could take the language liberal powers used to justify fair treatment and national rights, and use it as camouflage for coercion. That test led to Munich in 1938. At the time, many wanted desperately to believe it saved peace. That desire matters. It tells you how exhausted Europe still was, how badly people wanted to escape another descent into war. But what Munich actually did was hand Hitler another lesson in the profitability of brinkmanship. By threatening war and presenting himself as a man with one more limited demand, he gained territory without facing the united military resistance that might have checked him. And then came the moment that stripped away much of the illusion, when Hitler moved beyond the Sudetenland and swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia. It became much harder to pretend he was merely gathering German-speaking populations or correcting specific injustices from Versailles. At that point, the pattern was clear. This wasn't a dictator with a list of grievances he wanted settled so Europe could stabilize. This was a dictator using each success to build toward the next one. That's what made the 1930s so dangerous. Every time Hitler pushed and got ground, the next push became easier to imagine. Every concession weakened the value of further warnings. Every success hardened Hitler's confidence and narrowed Europe's options. The crisis was no longer a matter of isolated disputes. It was becoming a chain reaction. The next target would be Poland. And by then, the idea that Europe could contain this crisis without finally confronting it was hanging by a thread. Poland wasn't just another crisis on the map. By the time Hitler turned toward it, too many lines had already been crossed. Germany's expansion could no longer be honestly understood as a limited process of revision. It had become a demonstration that force, intimidation, and stage grievance could keep redrawing Europe as long as the cost of stopping it seemed higher than the cost of allowing it. This time, Britain and France tried to draw a line. Their guarantees to Poland mattered not because they erased years of hesitation, but because they showed the democracies were finally beginning to understand the scale of the threat. Another concession couldn't simply be folded into one old language of preserving peace. Another swallowed state wouldn't stabilize Europe. It would invite the next swallowing after that. Then came one of the most shocking diplomatic moves of the era: the Nazi-Soviet Pact. On the surface, it seemed almost impossible. The Nazi regime built much of its identity around hatred of Marxism and the Soviet Union. The Soviet regime treated fascism as a mortal ideological enemy. And yet, in August 1939, the two powers reached a cold strategic agreement. What made the pact even darker was the secret protocol behind it, which divided parts of Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. That meant Poland wasn't just facing invasion, it was being trapped between two great powers that had quietly agreed to carve up the region in advance. The pact mattered for several grim reasons. It reduced the immediate danger of a two-front war on Germany. It isolated Poland. It gave Hitler breathing room, and it announced to the world that hard-edged statecraft had overtaken any remaining illusions about a stable European order. By that point, the machinery was ready. Germany invaded Poland from the west on September 1st, 1939. Soviet forces entered from the east on September 17th. At that point, the long European crisis ceased to be a crisis and became what it had threatened to become for years: open war. Britain and France declared war on Germany, and with those declarations, the long slide finally hit bottom. Diplomacy had failed. The hope that aggression could be contained by concession had failed. The belief that Europe might absorb one more violation without breaking had failed. The war that so many had feared, delayed, and tried to negotiate around was now here. Poland was the point of no return, not just because it triggered declarations of war, but because it exposed the truth that had been building beneath the entire decade. Europe hadn't been preserving peace by yielding ground to aggression. It had been financing a larger catastrophe with time, hesitation, and the hope that somebody else would stop it before the bill came due. World War II is remembered through its most violent images, and understandably so. It's remembered through blitzkriegs, bombed cities, mass graves, camps, beaches, ruins, and the industrial scale of human destruction. But before all of that came the descent. Before the explosion came the cracks. It grew out of the wreckage of World War I. It grew out of a peace settlement that ended the fighting without healing the hatred. It grew out of humiliation in Germany, fear in France, exhaustion in Britain, instability across Europe, and a generation trying to rebuild while carrying trauma it didn't know how to resolve. It grew out of economic collapse that made radical promises sound like rescue. It grew out of authoritarian movements that fed on fear of disorder and fear of revolution. It grew out of democracies that remembered the last slaughter so vividly that they misread the kind of enemy now standing in front of them. And it grew step by step because every failure to stop aggression made the next act of aggression easier. The road to war wasn't one leap. It was a sequence, a poisoned peace, a humiliated nation, a fragile republic, an economic crash, a demagogue offering myth instead of truth, a continent growing harder and less democratic, caution turning into paralysis, democracy turning into delay, delay turning into invitation, and finally Poland, where the accumulated failures of 2 decades snapped into open conflict. Europe had spent 20 years trying to make sure the last catastrophe would never happen again. Instead, it created the conditions for one even worse, and now that the fire had started, it wouldn't stay contained to one border, one dispute, or even one continent. The war that followed would spread across the world, tear through armies and civilians alike, and become something more total, more mechanized, and more ruthless than the broken men of 1918 could have imagined. Because the next phase of this story isn't about how Europe slid into hell. It's about what happened after it got there.